Hey guys, how are you? Welcome to LAU Philosophy, and I guess I'm going to be giving you the instructions for the competition that you guys will have in a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about philosophy, and then after that we'll talk a little bit about what the competition will actually entail. So it's going to be mainly focused on philosophical method rather than the content of philosophy, and I'll say what that means in just a second. Okay, so look. If you look at philosophy and you look at the questions that philosophy raises a whole variety of questions, and it's very hard to see, how all of these questions are philosophical questions. So let me just give you some examples. In philosophy, you might ask, what's the difference between right and wrong? And what makes a right action right and a wrong action wrong? So this would be one branch of philosophy, ethics. You might also ask questions about the nature of knowledge. You could ask, how many things can humans know? Can we know anything at all? Is knowledge even possible for us? So that would be another branch of philosophy which we call epistemology. We could also ask questions about the nature of reality. So for instance, we could ask, what are these material things that we see in front of us? What's this wall? Or, what are bodies in general? Or how are bodies related to minds? These would be questions in metaphysics or about the mind. So now, given that philosophy addresses a whole variety of questions, you might wonder, well, what is it that makes all of these questions philosophical? Or what is it that unifies the philosophical treatment of these issues? And in fact, just like any domain has its methods, right? So imagine that you're doing mathematics, right? You probably need a calculator. That's a tool that you use in mathematics. You might also use a ruler if you're going to do some geometry. And so these are the tools that you use for the discipline. In the same way, philosophy has its own tools. There's the tool that we use for all our treatment of these many different and difficult questions is logic, right? And it's this that we're going to be focusing on throughout the competition. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go through a short discussion of some basic logical ideas or some basic ways of reasoning, which will allow you to be able to do philosophy in any domain in a much better way than you would have been able to otherwise. Okay, so maybe I should just start by saying, that the competition is going to be based on three types of questions. So one type of question is, are the arguments going to be valid? So you'll see what that means in just a bit. Another type of question is, I'm going to ask you, given that the argument is valid, what form of valid argument is it? And this is also something that you'll see in just a little bit. And then finally, I'm going to ask you what type of fallacy is being committed. So we'll also see what that means in just a second. And then the final part of the competition is just a combination of these. Okay, so look, if we're going to be dealing with these very hard philosophical questions, we need to have a method that will ensure that we're moving from point A to point B in a straight line rather than going in a circle. Very often when people have conversations that are philosophical, they end up going in circles. And this is because they don't know how to reason from one step to the other. And this is why logic is so important for philosophy. And you could think that there's actually two sorts of issues in logic that we're interested in. On the one hand, what you want to do is you want to start with some true things and ensure that you're only going to get true things afterwards. So one part of logic is just ensuring that you're expanding your knowledge positively and in the right direction. But another part is to prevent making mistakes. And so this is the two parts that we're going to be talking about. First, I'm going to show you how to reason well. Then I'm going to show you how it is that you can avoid bad reasoning, because bad reasoning is easy to do because there are some arguments that are kind of seductive on the human mind, even though they're wrong. Okay. So let's start talking then about this reasoning. Like I said, in philosophy we're dealing with a lot of topics, but in a way there's always a method of negotiating between different points of view. And the method of negotiating is the stuff that I just called logic. And so as philosophers, we talk about what we call arguments. When you're trying to give reasons for something that you believe, so imagine that you believe that God exists or you believe that God doesn't exist, we don't really care about your opinion. what we really want to know is, why do you believe that God exists, or why do you believe that God doesn't exist? And by telling us those reasons, you put us in a position to evaluate the claim that you're ultimately making, which is that God exists or that God doesn't. So, the things that are going to support this conclusion, we call those premises. So we have an argument. An argument is composed, it's a series of sentences, and it's composed of some sentences which we call the premises of the argument, and some sentences which we call the conclusions of the argument. And the idea is that the premises are supposed to support the conclusions in a way that makes it rational to believe them. So in other words, they give rational support to the conclusion. And you want to distinguish this sort of rational support for the conclusion from other types of support. Look, imagine that you believe something. Imagine that you believe that, for instance, God exists, or you believe that the material world depends on your mind. In either of these cases, how can you convince somebody else to believe you? Well, there's lots of different ways. Here's one way you might do it. You might put a gun to their head and say, either believe me or else I shoot you. And now they'll believe you. You might also try to bribe them. You could just give them lots of money and then they'll believe you. The problem with these methods is that they're not rational. Once the gun goes away, the person's going to change their mind. And once they've taken the money, maybe they'll stop believing what you said. By contrast, in arguments, when we give philosophical arguments, we're giving somebody a rational support for the conclusion that they're reaching. And this means that the reasons we're giving them are reasons that will force them from the inside to believe what it is that we're saying. So, how is that possible? Well, let me show you just one version of an argument. This is a simple argument. So, I'm going to write this out. So as you can see, what we can do is we can say that premise 1 is premise 1 is A is B, premise 2 is B is C, and from premises 1 and 2, we can get the conclusion that A is C. So if I believe that A is B and I believe that B is C, then I have to believe that A is C. This would be one example of an argument. And as you saw, I put premise 1 on the first, premise 2 on the second, and then the conclusion is the thing that follows from these two. So the first premise, or the first sentence that we come up with, is that A is identical to B, and then we say, oh, but also B is identical to C. And from these two rationally support the conclusion that A is identical to C, since if A is B and B is C, A is C. Okay. So let's talk a little bit now about how we can construct these arguments in a more detailed way. In fact, there's many different types of arguments in philosophy. There's what we call deductive arguments, inductive arguments, abductive arguments, reductio arguments. So there's a whole host of these types of arguments. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on only the most important type of argument that's used in philosophy, and this is what we're going to call a deductive argument. It's in fact a deductive direct argument, but for now let's just call it a deductive argument. And a deductive argument, what makes it so special and what makes philosophers so interested in these types of arguments is that they're arguments that ensure that if you start with something true, you'll always end with something true. It's like somebody you can trust fully. As long as I tell you the truth, you'll tell me back the truth. And that's what a deductive argument is like, which is why philosophers like them so much. Because it means that if you're starting in the right place, you'll always end in the right place. You don't have to worry about walking the path and losing your way. Okay, so what's a deductive argument? Well, every type of argument can be better or worse, and a deductive argument is always an argument that aims at being deductively sound. So, deductive arguments always aim at being sound arguments. And to be sound arguments, they need to do something else first. They need to be deductively valid. So the way that you evaluate a deductive argument is you start by asking yourself, is this argument valid? And if the answer is yes, then you ask yourself, is it sound? You can't ask yourself, is it sound first before asking yourself if it's valid, because if it's not valid, it cannot be sound. And we'll see why in just a second. So, what are these two concepts of validity and soundness? Well, look, the easiest way to think of validity is that validity refers to that feature of arguments that allows them to transmit the truth in a clean way. Validity, you can ask yourself the following question. You can say to yourself, if I believe the premises, would I have to believe the conclusion? And now I want you to notice that when you're asking if an argument is valid, or you're asking if I believe the premises, should I believe the conclusion, you're not saying you believe the premises. You're just saying if you believe them. And the question is, if you believe them, would you have to believe the conclusion that follows from them? If the answer is yes, then that's what makes the argument valid. So, look, imagine that we begin with a weird argument. So I'm Rami, right? And we can give this argument. We can say, Rami is a cat. All cats are dinosaurs. Therefore, Rami is a dinosaur. Now, initially, people normally want to say, oh, look, but this is false. Rami's not a cat. Rami's a human being, so it can't be a good argument. But actually, that's wrong. What you need to start by doing is you need to ask yourself, is this argument valid? In other words, if I believed its premises, would I really have to believe the conclusion? Well, let's think about it. Imagine that you believe that Rami is a cat. And imagine that you believe that all cats are dinosaurs. Would you have to believe that Rami is a dinosaur? And if we think about it, it seems like the answer is yes. We would have to believe that Rami is a dinosaur. After all, Rami is a cat, and all cats are dinosaurs, so Rami must be a dinosaur. So we actually know that this argument is valid. And what does that mean? It means that if the premises were true, the conclusion would always be true as well. Now, in this case, the premises aren't true, but we don't care about that. For validity, we're just saying if the premises were true, would we have to believe the conclusion, not they must be true. Okay, well, now that we've established that the argument is valid, our next step is to ask ourselves, is the argument sound? And to ask this, actually, all we have to do is say, given that the argument is valid, are its premises true? So now if we go back to the original argument we started with, Rami is a cat, all cats are dinosaurs, therefore Rami is a dinosaur. Well, we can immediately tell that this argument is not sound because its premises are false. Rami is not a cat, and it's not the case that all cats are dinosaurs. So we know that the argument is not sound even if it's valid. So, as you can see, there's kind of two layers. You don't start out by asking, are the premises true? This is because you're more interested in how the premises and the conclusion are related to each other. And this is what validity is checking for you. It's checking whether there's a good connection between the things you're starting with and the things you're ending with. If you don't check that there's a good connection, then you're going to get an argument that might be true, but it's not going to be true for the right reasons. It's just going to be accidentally true. So maybe I can give you an example of that. Imagine that I give you the following argument. I say, Rami is a mammal. All humans are mammals. Therefore, Rami is a human. Well, this argument, if you started out by looking at whether the premises are true or not, you're going to notice that everything is true. So Rami is a human. That's true. Rami is a mammal. That's true. All humans are mammals, that's true, and Rami is a human, that's true. But the problem is that in this argument, it's not a valid argument, because think about it. We're saying, if you start out believing that Rami is a mammal, and you believe that all humans are mammals, would you have to believe that Rami is a human? Well, let's think about it. If Rami is a mammal, and all humans are mammals, all this tells us is that Rami might be a human. Because Rami could be another type of mammal. Since all we know is that Rami is a mammal and we know that all humans are mammals, we don't know for sure that Rami is a human. Because all we know is that all humans are mammals, not that all mammals are humans. Maybe there are some mammals that are not humans, like cats, for instance. So Rami might be a cat. In this argument, right, you can see that the argument is not a good argument because it's an invalid argument. Although its premises are all true, it's not an argument that will ensure the truth of its conclusion. And you can actually see that you're making this sort of mistake in the argument by actually substituting variables. So imagine that you said to yourself, Let's not say Rami is a mammal, all humans are mammals, so Rami is a human. Let's replace Rami with something else. Let's replace Rami with, for instance, Tom from Tom and Jerry. So Tom is a cat, right? And we start out by saying Tom is a mammal. Well, that's true. All humans are mammals. Well, that's true. So Tom is a human. That's false. So you just got true, true, false. But this can never happen in a valid argument. In a valid argument, it's always the case that if you start out with truth, you'll end with truth. So actually, by substituting the name Rami for the name Tom, you actually reveal that the argument was a mistaken argument. Okay, so look, I just explained to you the theory, and now what I should do is go through a little bit of a few examples with you guys, just to give you a sense of how valid arguments work. And I'm just going to show you a few arguments on this iPad here. These are the slides that you guys should have with this video. Okay, so take a look at this example. This example says, X is P, all P's are Q's, so X is Q. Now, if you look at this argument, you'll notice that it's actually just an abstracted version of the argument we just gave. The argument we just gave is Rami is a human, or this is the first argument. So let's take a new argument for all together. Let's start with the argument that now, Tom is a cat, all cats are mammals, so Tom is a mammal. Well, that would be like X is P, Tom is a cat, and all P's are Q's, all cats are mammals, so X is Q, or Tom is a mammal. Okay, let's look at another argument. So here's another one. If you look at this one says, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. So imagine that you give yourself the following argument. You say, if I'm hungry, I will eat. I am hungry, so therefore I will eat. If P, then Q. If I'm hungry, I will eat. So I'm hungry, therefore I'm going to eat. So that's if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Okay, let's take a look at another one. We might say, here's a modus tollens argument, and this one says, if P, then Q, not Q, so not P. Let's give an example of this. We say, if I'm hungry, I will eat. And now we say, I didn't eat. Well, we know that if we're hungry, we're going to eat. So if we didn't eat, then we know that we're not hungry. That would be if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Okay, let's look at another argument. Here's a disjunctive syllogism. And this one says, no. Okay, well, give me a second, guys. Here's a disjunctive syllogism. And it says either P or Q, not P, so Q. So let's take a look at an example of this sort. We might say something like, either I'm going to go to Burger King or I'm going to go to McDonald's. And then I say, but I'm not going to go to McDonald's. So this pretty much means I'm going to go to Burger King. Since I've given myself two options, I said one of these options is not the case, then it means that the next option must be the case. Okay, good. So look, there's a bunch of other arguments in your text, and you can take a look at them. In the handout, you'll see a lot of the explanations I just gave you. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to point out something. You'll see one of the slides in the ones that I've given you that says criticizing any deductive argument, and then it has two forms of arguments on it. These are called affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. I want you to notice that these arguments are bad arguments that nevertheless look like they're good arguments. You can see that these arguments are not deductively valid, and you should test that out yourselves. Try to put an argument into them and then see how this argument looks like it might be true, but in fact, even if the premises were true, the conclusion could turn out to be false. Okay, good. So I've just now gone through the first part, which is the part where I'm explaining to you how it is that you get to, how it is that you start from true premises and you reach true conclusions. So this is a way of expanding your knowledge in a way that is secure. You can always start from something true and get to something true. But, like I said at the beginning, the problem is that you're trying to do two things as a philosopher. if you're trying to deal with these hard questions, like questions about the nature of God's existence, on whether abortion is right or wrong, on whether we should treat each other in this way or that way, then what you really want to do is you want to ensure that not only are you taking correct steps, but also you're avoiding missteps, right? So you're both trying to preserve the truth and you're trying not to make mistakes. So in the next part of the discussion, I'm going to focus on how we're not going to make mistakes in our reasoning. And to do that, we're going to look at these things that we call fallacies, where fallacies are these seductive forms of argument that look like they're right, but in fact they're not right. And you'll definitely be able to recognize many of them because very often we hear them in the news, we hear them with people say them, we hear them amongst friends and so on. Okay, so let's get started on these fallacies. We're going to look at 14 different fallacies, and all of these are mistakes in reasoning that initially seem like they're very good ways of reasoning, but in fact they're bad ways of reasoning. They're bad ways of giving arguments. And the first one we're going to look at is what we call the slippery slope argument. Oh, sorry, actually, let's make that the straw man argument. So the straw man argument is an argument where you misrepresent somebody else's argument to make it easier to dismiss or to attack them. So, in other words, you start out arguing, but then your opponent is saying something. So what you do is you simplify that thing and then you attack the simplified version, not the real version. And by doing this, we call this a straw man because it's like you build a straw version of your friend, right? And you attack that instead of attacking the real target. And the problem with this argument is that it's very unsatisfying. If somebody misrepresents you, you're not going to be very impressed if they then attack the misrepresentation. You want them to attack the view that you're giving. And so one of the things we often do in philosophy is we adopt what we call the principle of charity, where the principle of charity says you have to make your opponent's argument as good as possible before you start attacking it. Because if you want to convince them, you want to show them that you totally understand what they're saying and that nevertheless you can argue with them. So what's a good version of a straw man argument? Imagine that somebody says this, okay, Miriam believes it's okay to have an abortion, so she's okay with killing innocent people. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that even if Miriam says that she's okay with abortion, that doesn't mean that she's okay with killing innocent people. This would be a very bad version of her argument. She might not think that a fetus, which is what gets aborted, is a person, and she might not think that the fetus is innocent. So by construing her argument against abortion as an argument that says we should kill innocent people, we're actually shrinking or misrepresenting her argument and then attacking that. But of course, Miriam's not going to be very convinced if we attack her in this way. What she needs is a reason to think that abortion is wrong, not some accusation about her being pro the killing of innocent people. Definitely, she might not be, while still being somebody who's pro-abortion. Okay, so that's a straw man argument. Let's now look at the other sort of argument, which, as I said, is called a slippery slope. So a slippery slope argument is an argument where you make it sound as if you took the first step, you'll slide all the way to the bottom. And the idea is that this is the slippery slope. So you would say that if we allow A to happen, then B will happen, and because B will happen, C will happen, because C will happen, D will happen, all the way up to Z. So A shouldn't happen because Z will happen. And you can actually see this type of argument in lots of different cases. So some people will say something like this. They'll say, look, if we build smart computers, then the next thing you know, they're going to be more intelligent than us. Then the next thing you know, there's going to be robots, and then the robots are going to turn against us, and then they're going to enslave us, and then the whole human race will be dead. So therefore, I'm against technology. Notice in this argument, it's all a slippery slope. It's like if you start by taking the first step, you build an intelligent computer, then all of a sudden this computer is going to suddenly become, a robot, then this robot's going to become evil, then this evil thing is going to, enslave humans. So this is why you're against, the building of intelligent machines, or in other words, technology. Now, this is a very bad sort of argument, right? It doesn't follow that the last step will happen just because the first step happened. Sometimes people will give this about, gay marriage as well. They'll say something like, okay, look, if we allow people who are not, heterosexual couples to get married, then this is what's going to be the consequence. First of all, we're going to let a man marry a man and a woman marry a woman. But then the next thing is that we're going to let a man marry a child and a child marry a woman. And then we're going to let animals marry humans and humans marry animals. And this is going to cause chaos in society. Nobody will have proper sex again. And then society will die. Well, again, this is a very bad form of argument. Why? Because just because you allow the first step, it doesn't mean you have to allow the other steps. It's not like it's a slippery slope. You can take one step at a time without having to take all the steps all at once. So that's what's bad about a slippery slope argument. Okay, third type of argument. This argument is called special pleading. Special pleading is when, after you've given an argument and your opponent has objected to this argument, what you do is you introduce extra facts to avoid having to confront the fact that what you said is false. So this sometimes happens in different normal contexts, but let's give you a specific example. Imagine Mahmoud claims to have psychic abilities. We can pretend he says, I can read other people's minds, or I can move objects with my head, that's telekinesis or something like that. So Mahmoud makes this claim. So now when the scientists come to Mahmoud and they tell him, okay, prove it to us under scientific conditions, he suddenly says, look, my magical powers have disappeared. This is because they sometimes appear, they sometimes disappear. So now he's introduced a new idea in order to avoid being shown that he's mistaken. Or take another example. Sometimes people believe in astrology. And if you read astrology, you will often find that it doesn't really predict very much about what's happening with you. So now imagine you take a professional astrologist and you tell them, predict my future. And now, if they fail to predict your future, they might say, I failed in this case because there was a special circumstance. In this circumstance, I can't really get it right, etc., etc. So this is what we call special pleading. It's like you're trying to make a special excuse for the fact that you turned out to be mistaken. Okay, so let's look at another sort of argument. This is called a false dilemma. A false dilemma is a really important form of argument because many people use it and we don't notice very easily that people are using it, but it's a very harmful type of argument. So it's an argument where you try to make somebody believe that there are only two alternatives for them to choose from, when in fact there are way more than two alternatives for them to choose from. So sometimes people in Lebanon, very often in politics, we hear this. Something like, either you are with the Lebanese government or you're not. Or either you're with this political party or you're not. Well, think about it. Is it true that you just have to be either pro or against? No, not at all. After all, you could think that there are some things that the Lebanese government does that are right and some things that are wrong. In those things that they're right in, you should be with them. In the things that they're wrong in, you can be against them. So you can be both with and against them depending on what they're doing. Similarly, take a political party. Imagine somebody says, this political party, you have to either be pro it or against it. Well, do I have to be? No. Sometimes these political parties do correct things, and when they do correct things, we should stand by them. But when they do wrong things, we should stand against them. We don't have to choose. It's not either all this or all that. We can choose a more nuanced position. There are middle spots that can be chosen, not just these two alternatives that are extreme alternatives. Okay, here's another type of argument. This is called an ad hominem argument or an appeal to the person argument. So an ad hominem argument is an argument where rather than attacking the argument that somebody else gives you, you attack the person themselves. This is why it's called an appeal to the person. It's like, because you said it, it's wrong, not because of what you said. And this is a problem because, in fact, arguments should only be evaluated on whether their premises are valid and their conclusions following from their premises, and then the whole thing being sound. We shouldn't evaluate an argument on the basis of who said it, right? Anybody could say a correct argument and anybody can say a bad argument. So here's an example. You can imagine Bart Simpson saying something like this about his sister. He says, she gives an argument and he says, don't listen to Lisa, she's a girl. Well, notice that Regardless of what Lisa said, it doesn't matter whether she's a girl or not. It doesn't really matter who said the argument. The question is, are the premises valid and are the premises true? And if they are, then it doesn't really matter who said it. So the fact that Lisa's a girl or Lisa's not a girl, right, has no relevance at all on the question. This would be an attack against the person, not against their argument. The argument would remain untouched. Okay, here's another form of argument. So this one's called the bandwagon, but you can also call it an appeal to popularity. And an appeal to popularity is an argument that very often people kind of confusedly believe in. So here's what the argument says. It says, look, if we start out by believing something that other people believe, then somehow this is better, right? This is the appeal to popularity. So you argue that a claim may be true or must be true because many people say that it is true. So here's an example of this. Imagine that you're talking about, a movie, let's imagine it's Batman, The Dark Knight, and then here's the argument you give. You say, of course, The Dark Knight is the best movie ever. Everybody thinks so. Well, think about it. Does it matter whether everybody thinks so or not? Fine, it's popular, if people, popularly believe something that, is something, but does it show that it's true? Well, the problem is it doesn't very often show it's true, because here's the thing, all people could be mistaken. Think about so many times in human history where many people believed something, but it was wrong. Once upon a time, the majority of people believed that the earth was flat, but they were mistaken. So if you gave an argument where you said the earth is flat because everybody thinks so, you would be wrong. Similarly, once upon a time, everybody believed, that women were inferior to men. Were they right? No, they weren't. Sometimes people believed that some people should be the slaves of other people. Were they right? No. The fact that an opinion is popular doesn't make it right. The fact that an opinion is popular means that many people believe it, but people can be mistaken, so there's no proof of the rightness of something just from the fact that many people accept it. Okay, so similar to this appeal to popularity argument is another type of argument which we can call an appeal to tradition. If you like, appeal to popularity is you're saying the people who are around right now, they all believe this argument and this is why we should accept it. By contrast, in an appeal to tradition, you're saying, many people in the past have accepted it, therefore we should accept it. Both arguments are terrible arguments because whether people in the past or people in the present, people can be mistaken. We shouldn't believe things just because many people believe these things. We should believe them because we have reasons to believe them. So you are then arguing in an appeal to tradition that a claim is true because many people accept this in the tradition. So here's an argument of this sort that you might give. You might say, look, for thousands of years, people have believed in God. Therefore, God exists. Well, the problem is that for thousands of years, people believed in slavery. That doesn't mean that slavery or believe in the goodness of slavery. Does that mean that slavery is good? No. It's not that God doesn't exist or that God does exist. It's just that the opinion of people doesn't prove to us whether God exists or doesn't exist. It could be that for thousands of years, people believed that God exists, but in fact, God doesn't. And it could have been the reverse. It could have been that for thousands of years, people believed that God didn't exist, but they were all wrong. God did exist. So the fact that many people in history believed something doesn't prove that that thing is true, no more than the fact that many people around you believe it's true proves that it's true. Okay, so into the eighth type of argument, and this is also similar to the other two types of arguments, but here's what it's called. It's called an appeal to nature. So, an appeal to nature is where you argue that something is good or right or valid or justified or true because it's natural. And now the problem with this is that nature doesn't really tell us what we should do or what's right or what's good or any of this stuff. And you can see this very clearly because look, so let me give you first an example of this argument. So somebody might say something like this. You should be careful about taking Panadol because Panadol is not natural, so it's not good. Now, if you look at this argument, they're right, Panadol isn't natural. But the question is something that is natural necessarily good? So take some examples. Look, children by nature, they can be very mean to each other. They can hit each other and they can hurt each other. Still, nobody would say cruelty is good. Children, by nature, are not very clean. They don't, ask to go shower. They very often want to play with the mud and dirty themselves and so on. So now they're dirty. So you might say children are by nature dirty. Does that mean being dirty is good or, the ideal way to be? Absolutely not. The thing is, nature doesn't dictate what should happen. It only tells us what does happen. And what does happen might not be the best thing that happens. Very often we say, humans, instinctively can kill. But nobody thinks that killing is right just because we do it by nature. Okay, so here's now another type of argument. And this is called an appeal to ignorance. And it's an argument where here's what you say. You say, look, this claim is true or false because we don't know that it isn't. And so, in other words, you're trying to justify the truth or the falsehood of something just because you don't know, we don't have evidence one way or the other. So, let me give you some examples. Some people will say, look, nobody knows that they're going to die permanently, nobody knows that we're gone permanently when we die, so there must be an afterlife. So here's then the argument, right? The argument is that just because nobody knows what happens after death, then this is proof that there is life after death. You might actually argue the opposite. You might say, look, there is no life after death because nobody knows what happens after death. But I want you to notice that whichever argument you choose, they're both terrible arguments. The fact that you don't know what happens after death doesn't prove to you anything. It doesn't prove that there's life after death or that there's no life after death. If I don't know, that something is the case, that doesn't show anything. Some people will say, I believe in aliens because nobody has proved that there are no aliens. Well, if nobody has proved that there are no aliens, that doesn't mean that there are aliens. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that we have no evidence one way or the other. So that's why we call this an appeal to ignorance. It's like, because I'm ignorant, I know this. In fact, you can't know something just because you're ignorant. Okay, here's now another type of argument, and this is an argument that, is often used by people, So this is called the no true Scotsman argument, and the argument says the following, right? It's making an appeal to purity as a way of dismissing or revealing that a criticism or a flaw in an argument. So the idea is that you start out by saying that an argument is wrong because it's not pure enough in some sense. It's not true enough. Let me give you some examples of this. This is kind of a fun example, right? So imagine that two friends who play video games start talking to each other, and now friend number one says, nobody who has played video games all his life doesn't like Call of Duty. And then friend number two says, well, I've played video games all my life and I don't like Call of Duty. So now friend number one says, no true gamer doesn't like Call of Duty. So now this addition of the true, this idea that actually there's something even more, pure that is the true thing, and then this is why you're not the true thing. So this form of argument, right, is an argument where you reject somebody's contribution just because, or by saying to them, no, you don't have it exactly right, or something like that. But of course, this is also not a legitimate form of argument. Okay, here's another form of argument. This is called personal incredulity. And in personal incredulity, you say that because one finds something difficult to understand, it's therefore not true. So the idea is that because you find it very hard to believe this, that thing can't be true. And of course, this is a very bad sort of argument, because just because you don't understand something, that doesn't prove that that thing is mistaken. So imagine that Hadi says, you expect me to believe that some sentences are neither clearly true nor clearly false? That's just incomprehensible. Well, yes, Hadi might think that this is really surprising, but it's not proof that there aren't sentences that are neither true nor false, or that are both true and false. The fact that he finds it shocking doesn't prove anything about the way it is. In fact, Hadi is wrong, because there are sentences that do seem to be true and false, or neither true nor false. Let me give you an example. So imagine that you say, this sentence is false. Well, if this sentence is false is true, then it means that if it's true, if it's a true sentence, then this sentence is false is going to be false. So if it's true, it's going to be false. At the same time, if this sentence is false, then this means that it's true. So this sentence, when it's true, it's false, and when it's false, it's true. So Hadi's mistaken. Just because he can't conceive of it doesn't mean that it's not really out there. Okay, here's another type of argument. This is argument number 12, or sorry, fallacy number 12. So it's called a false cause. And a false cause is presuming that because of a perceived correlation between two things, then one thing must have caused the other. So here's what you're saying. You're saying that, oh, this thing came first and then this thing came after it, so this one was caused by this one. And that's not a good form of argument because, well, let's see. Here's an example of this argument. Imagine that somebody says, in the last 5 years, feminist movements have become more active in Lebanon. And in the last 5 years, Lebanon has also become less stable and more filled with garbage. So, feminism is the cause of the instability and the garbage in Lebanon. Well, as you can see, this argument, yes, one thing happened and the other thing happened, but it's not that one thing happened because of the other, right? There's no cause and effect relationship between those two things. It's not that maybe the feminist movements were growing and maybe the city was sinking at the same time, but those were two independent events. Just because two things happen at the same time, it doesn't mean that one caused the other or the other caused the one. So that's what a false cause argument is. Okay, final two types of arguments, and these are kind of reverses of one another. And so here's the fallacy of composition. So the fallacy of composition is arguing that what can be said about the parts can be said about the whole. So if I can say it about the parts of a thing, I can say it about the whole of the thing. And the problem with this is that although it's sometimes true, it's not always true that what you can say of the parts, you can say of the whole. So take an example. Imagine that somebody says, every feather is light. So the sum of all of these feathers is light. Well, it doesn't follow. The fact that every feather weighs, 1 gram, it doesn't follow from this, that a ton of feathers are going to weigh 1 gram. In fact, they're going to weigh a ton, right? So the fact that one part is light doesn't mean that the whole is light. 1,000 billion feathers might not be light at all, even if each individual feather is light. Okay, the reverse of this argument would be saying that what can be said about the whole can be said about each of the parts. So rather than saying something about the parts, then going on to say the same thing about the whole, here you start out by saying something about the whole, and then you go on to attributing that thing to the parts. So imagine that somebody says, this car is green, so every part of this car is green. Well, it doesn't follow from the fact that the car itself is green that every part of it is green. Some of its parts might not be green at all because they're, the engine or something like that, and they're more gray or metallic or whatever. So the idea that if something is attributable to the whole, it doesn't get attributed to the parts, that's what we call the fallacy of division. Okay, so we've kind of gone through all of these types of bad arguments. And this is bad arguments, we call them fallacies. They're mistakes in arguing. And again, just as a reminder, the competition, I'll ask you, first of all, to distinguish arguments that are valid from those that are invalid. Then I'm going to ask you to distinguish different types of valid arguments. So you have to know which one's a modus ponens, which one's a simplification, which one's a hypothetical syllogism, and so on. These are the ones that you're going to find in the slides. And then the third part, you're going to be asked to tell me which fallacy is being committed. And then the final part, you'll have some combination of these. Okay, guys, so I hope this has been helpful and clear. And if you guys have any questions, you can either leave comments below, or if you like, you can email me or message me on Facebook. You can go to www.facebook.com/LAUphilosophy, and if you message on that site, I'll be able to answer you, and then I can clarify any questions that you have. Okay, I look forward to meeting you guys in person. I'm sorry I couldn't meet you in person this time, but I guess we'll meet soon enough. Bye.